Hello everyone, and welcome to the first Thursday Club in April. Hopefully you've all enjoyed some of the more spring-like weather recently. I saw a swallow this morning, so that was nice. Things are warming up and moving on. Today we're going to be hearing from Mark Lang. He's going to be talking about where we are up to with regards to the BNG and how it's going to work. Before I hand over to Mark, though, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. Those of you that have been on these things before will be familiar with how this runs. We'll have your microphones muted, so for obvious reasons, but we do want to hear from you. It's really important that we get your questions, and so you'll be able to use the dialogue box to put questions in as Mark's talking. And then at the end, well, during the talk, I'll sort of collate those, and at the end, we'll have a short Q&A session. After the webinar, we'll be sending out a questionnaire, which would be really useful if you could fill that in and give us any feedback you've got, which it really helps with making this the way it is at the moment. Right, so Mark Lang, he's a associate director in RSK Biocensus. He's a chartered ecologist. He's been working in consultancy for 30 years. Blimey. He divides his time between RSK Biocensus and RSK Wilding, and is primarily an ornithologist and botanist, but has expertise in habitat survey and assessment. He's currently focusing on ecological impacts and delivery of large-scale solar energy, obviously which is biodiversity net gain is going to be a key element. So he's following that field with interest. I'll hand over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Hi guys, yeah, good afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity net gain. Right, just checking you can see my screen, Tim, before I start.
Yep, all looks good.
Just turn. Okay, so this is just a short presentation picking out some key highlights from a consultation that Defra held last year, just with regards to how biodiversity net gain is likely to work, and just a little bit about further guidance that's in the pipeline, really. So most of you are aware that the Environment Act from 2021 mandated that developers must deliver a minimum of 10% net gain on new developments. And consultation last year, the government focused on its thoughts about how the process is likely to work. As you can see from the pie chart, a large number of people responded, largely local planning authorities, but also organisations like ourselves, so conservation consultancies and ecological consultants and various other things. So it was a fairly detailed and involved consultation, and lots of people responded, as did RSK Biocensus and RSK Wilding. So bits I'm going to focus on are just some of the exemptions from net gain, what we mean by irreplaceable habitats, how phased development might work, what we mean by additionality and stacking and what government thinks, national infrastructure projects, town and country planning projects, habitat banks, conservation covenants, and just a little bit about the on-site register. So first thing is exemptions. There are small developments that are likely to be excluded from biodiversity net gain, so they will be exempt from the requirement to deliver a 10% gain. And these are small developments less than 25 metres squared or 5 metres for where they affect linear habitats like a hedgerow. Householder application, so we're not expecting a new extension to qualify for net gain. Also biodiversity gain sites where habitats are being enhanced for biodiversity. But what's important to also understand is that the government is excluding development on statutory sites from biodiversity net gain, because it's not, what it's trying to do in policy terms is prevent the biodiversity net gain procedure being used to justify development on statutory sites. But of interest, government does consider that local wildlife sites and local nature reserves should be eligible for enhancement through biodiversity net gain. And I think this is because there currently isn't really a funding mechanism for local wildlife sites and local nature reserves to achieve good condition, whereas there is a statutory process and the assumption that owners of SSIs should be managing for SSIs to be in good condition. It's a bit of a moot point in the sense that we all know the majority of our statutory sites are not in good condition. They're not achieving favourable conservation status. So this might be a bit of a shot in the foot in some ways, and that perhaps biodiversity net gain might have liberated some funding that could have helped improve the condition of SSIs. But I think on the basis that there's already the legal requirement for SSIs to be in good condition, I can see the logic for the decision that government has made there. So irreplaceable habitats. So a number of habitats, ancient semi-natural woodland would be a good idea, are classed as irreplaceable habitat on the basis of, although they are possible to recreate, it takes a very long time. And for ancient woodland, we're perhaps looking at hundreds of years, and also we might not perhaps get the soil mycorrhizas and soil ground flora for thousands of years. So some habitats ideally shouldn't be built on, and these are to be excluded from the quantitative element within the biodiversity net gain assessment. However, there are exceptional circumstances in which loss of semi-natural habitat will occur. A good recent example would be HS2, because obviously with a linear railway line, you can't put massive bends in and void every bit of ancient woodland. So loss of irreplaceable habitat does occur. And where in the exceptional circumstances that it does occur, we still need to account for the losses and gains. So as well as providing information in relation to biodiversity net gain for development where it's deemed that the development is of significant priority or significantly important in the national context to justify loss of irreplaceable habitat, then there needs to be some kind of bespoke mitigation to account for that. And we're probably all aware, certainly amongst the ecology fraternity, those of us that have had involvement in HS2 will be aware of the kind of ratios of woodland planting and the bespoke mitigation put in place. So I hope that's fairly clear. Phase development. So lots of developments, particularly things like large-scale housing developments, are likely to occur over a number of phases. So it might be that they apply for outline permission and then detailed permission for each individual phase as they go forward. This can cause a problem with biodiversity net gain, because how do you guarantee where the biodiversity is delivered unless each phase delivers a 10% gain in biodiversity? And on some schemes, particular scheme I'm working on at the moment in Dorset, it's a housing development phased over 9 phases. Not each phase is being delivered by the same developer, and it's the second phase that will deliver the majority of the biodiversity net gain, because that's where the habitat creation will be. So what the government has asked is just an approach that's flexible, but gives local authorities a bit of discretion on a site-by-site basis, but also gives them reassurance that actually the biodiversity net gain will be delivered and who's responsible for delivering it. So local authorities will require additional biodiversity gain information that outlines how the biodiversity gain will be achieved across the site on a phase-by-phase basis, basically. So if all of the biodiversity is going to be delivered upfront, then it just needs to be a plan in place, and the local authorities will approve a biodiversity gain plan that sets that out. I suspect it's going to be on a phase-by sort of site-by-site basis as to how this works, but it's just understanding that there's going to need to be clear accountability and transparency moving forward. In a similar way to old mineral permissions, government's thinking that because mineral permissions are often quite outdated, but often have agreed restoration plans sometime in the future, that trying to apply the net gain criteria to that will be overly complex. So what they're hoping is that this would just be achieved through existing policy, really, and focusing on appropriate ecological outcomes rather than percentage targets. And this is quite linked with phase developments. We're working on a large-scale housing provision, large areas of which are either currently being quarried or are about to be quarried. So it's going to be phased over a long time, 30 to 40 years. And once the quarrying has ceased, then these sites will be put forward for housing allocation. But at the moment, it's unclear whether the quarries will be restored to what they were originally intended to be restored to as part of their agreed planning conditions, or whether they'll just be made safe and then put forward for housing. So it's quite difficult to know what the baseline will be, and we're having some fairly detailed negotiations with the local authority at the minute to determine the best way forward. But I think that's the answer with minerals permission, that it's going to be a case by case and early discussion and involvement with the local planning authority. Additionality. So this formed quite a large section of the Defra consultation, as lots of people had asked the question where we have to deliver habitat mitigation for legally protected species. So, for example, new hedgerow planting or scrub planting for dormice, say, or pond creation for great crested newts. Shouldn't we be able to use that to count towards a site's 10% net gain? And the government's decided that yes, you can, but on the basis that at least 10% of the net gain that needs to be achieved has to come from something else other than protected species mitigation. So, for example, if you have a development that has a baseline score of 10 biodiversity units, they need to score 11 biodiversity units in the post-development scenario to achieve their 10% net gain, then at least one unit should come from a separate activity, such as creation of habitat on site, which isn't required for legally protected species mitigation. And when I'm talking about protected species mitigation, I'm talking about habitat creation or enhancement, because I don't think we would count provision of reptile hibernacula or bat and bird boxes towards this in terms of additionality. But I think this is quite a welcome addition, because it does mean that developers don't have to A, provide land for protected species mitigation, and then B, provide land for biodiversity net gain, because any habitat creation they do for protected species will have a knock-on benefit for biodiversity. So this is quite positive, I think. Now, stacking is a bit more controversial, and it's where payments for biodiversity units could be combined with payments for other environmental or ecosystem benefit on the same parcel of land, hence stacking. And what government has indicated is that a landowner will be able to sell both biodiversity units and nutrient credits, so where they're within an area that needs to achieve nutrient neutrality, from the same nature-based intervention. So, for example, creation of woodland or wetland on a parcel of land. But what government has also indicated is they're not expecting a development or a landowner to be able to claim carbon credits and biodiversity units for the same piece of woodland, on the basis that you shouldn't be paid twice for doing the same thing. Now, I think there's some argument here to say that if you planted woodland for the purposes of carbon sequestration, also planting of that woodland does deliver some biodiversity benefit. But what the government has made clear is they're not expecting a landowner to be able to claim credits twice here. They've also indicated that perhaps if you're claiming some kind of environmental funding, perhaps, and the way I've interpreted this is thinking about agri-environment schemes, that if perhaps you're being funded to deliver habitat creation to a set condition, if you achieve over and above that condition, and you can clearly justify that, so say you're being paid to create meadow of moderate condition, but actually you can show that you've created meadow in good condition, then there should be the potential for you to sell that uplift between moderate and good as biodiversity units and sort of claim the excess. So I think this is quite a complicated area and doesn't all necessarily stack up at the moment, no pun intended, and that further guidance will come, and this will be of particular interest to landowners and land managers, particularly given the uncertainties with agricultural funding and agricultural subsidies and things at the moment. I do support the fact that we can at least claim both nutrient neutrality and biodiversity units, but the bit about carbon needs further exploration, I think. So, Town and Country Planning Act. So just very, very briefly, how the process is going to work. So local authorities will require from the developer biodiversity gain information in the form of a BNG statement. That will be provided alongside the planning application, which will be setting out the biodiversity baseline for the site, what the losses and gains will be, and how the development aims to achieve biodiversity net gain, before a biodiversity gain plan is then submitted, which is approved prior to commencement of development. And the biodiversity gain plan is where it will all be sewn up, signed, sealed and delivered, basically providing the sort of further detail. Government has indicated that it would rather incentivise on-site gains rather than off-site gains, on the basis that it's better to deliver the biodiversity benefit at the point of impact. What they're trying to avoid is developers saying, well, look, we're causing lots of damage locally, we'll buy an estate in Scotland and do all of our biodiversity gain provision there, because obviously that has no benefit for the local community where the damage is being done. But pleasingly, government is thinking that there will be times and locations where strategic provision of offsite will be quite useful. And looking at the work that Natural England are doing in sort of network recovery and local nature conservation strategies, looking at all of those, there will be areas of the country where it makes sense to deliver a strategic provision of biodiversity net gain. So, for example, linking areas of ancient woodland or linking triglycerides on prime biodiversity areas, that sort of thing. And 30 years is being set as the minimum period over which biodiversity gain sites need to be secured for. So in perpetuity in BNG terms at the moment means 30 years. So where's that one? So NSIP, so nationally significant infrastructure projects. So these are going to be treated basically the same as town and country planning applications, with no real distinction between the two. Government's giving developers until November 25 to get their act together, and everything else will be the same really. Any off-site provision of biodiversity gain will be recorded in the biodiversity gain site register, which we'll come to in a minute. And government has also indicated that they're not expected to make any new provisions for compulsory purchase in relation to delivering BNG. So no changes to the rules for compulsory purchase. And also, there are often areas within NSIP development within the red land boundary that's set aside for environmental mitigation. This might be biodiversity or protected species mitigation, but it also might be mitigation for things like flood alleviation, that kind of thing. And what government is indicating is they're not making any distinction between non-site habitats and designated environmental mitigation areas. But basically, NSIPs are going to be treated the same as town and country planning, which I think is positive. And largely, I think most NSIPs, certainly the ones that I'm working on at the moment, are already taking the biodiversity net gain approach. So habitat banks. So a habitat bank is simply an area where farmer, landowner is creating or enhancing habitat on the basis of selling any kind of increase in habitat condition it has to biodiversity units to developers that can't deliver biodiversity net gain on site. And the key thing here is that once a biodiversity unit is sold to a developer, the associated parcel of land within a habitat bank would need to be secured by legal agreement and registered prior to the approval of the biodiversity net gain plan. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about habitat banks. They're appearing all over the place. Lots of landowners are getting together, and companies like the Environment Bank are sort of creating banks across the country as we speak. So this is an area where we will see further growth, I think. Briefly, conservation covenants. So conservation covenants will be, basically it's going to be the legal agreement between a landowner responsible and a responsible body as to who will deliver the biodiversity net gain, and will be a legally binding agreement between them. So a conservation covenant needs to be a landowner with freehold or leasehold with more than 7 years, and a responsible body. And a responsible body can be a local authority, a public body or charity, or a private sector organisation, as long as the majority of their activities are related to nature conservation. And you must apply to become a responsible body, and you're agreeing with the landowner how you're delivering and what you're delivering and setting it out for 30 years. And then you need to register you'll need to register the conservation covenant on the appropriate local land changes register. So if land is sold before the 30 years are up, then obviously the covenant that's attached to that land goes to whoever buys the land next. So buying and selling. If developers can sell any excess biodiversity units that they have. Say, for example, they've created habitat on site, they've achieved their 10% net gain, but the habitat that they've created or enhanced, there's additional biodiversity units that aren't needed to compensate for the development that they've delivered, then they can sell that excess. And government isn't going to develop, so government's indicated that this is all going to be third-party led. They're not going to develop a centralized trading platform. And sellers, when they're selling, need to make sure that the price of the biodiversity unit is sufficient to cover the cost of creating or enhancing the habitat, any monitoring, and also the maintenance for the minimum period of 30 years. And obviously, if we say that we're going to create habitat of X condition, if X condition isn't being reached and monitoring is indicated that, there's going to need to be a feedback loop for remedial management to make sure that that happens. So I think biodiversity units are going to be quite highly priced because that's quite a big ask to manage and conserve habitat for a period of 30 years. Conservation management tends to be quite expensive, which is one of the reasons why nature reserves and local wildlife trusts and things find it quite difficult. So this is something that's going to be interesting to see how the sort of price and how the market sorts itself out. And work is underway. Government will provide guidance on the tax implications for habitat creation and enhancement, and biodiversity units will be subject to VAT. So just thinking about the future, what happens after 30 years, our landowner is going to say, right, thank you, I've had 30 years funding and plough good quality grassland back in and resume intensive agriculture. And to some extent, yes, that will happen, I think. But government likes to think that perhaps there will be incentives and perhaps that habitat will continue beyond the initial 30 years of establishment. And certainly for some habitat types like woodland or peatland restoration, obviously after 30 years would have achieved significant carbon gain. We wouldn't just want to fell, plough and go back to normal. So we're hoping that there will be new incentives come forward to enable the continuation of management for another 30 years. It might be that after 30 years, if we've achieved X biodiversity value on the site, then that can become the new baseline, and we could apply for further funding to enhance it further, that sort of thing. So I would like to think that we're not just ploughing everything in 30 years' time, but also as development comes forward, if new areas of habitat are being created as habitat has been maintained for 30 years and lost, I would hope that we would see a net gain as we go forward. What's not clear at the moment is what happens when you've developed conservation benefit on a site, whether you then have to take that as your new baseline, and whether things like the environment regulations will kick in, because obviously returning farmland to farmland is fine, but returning good quality grassland to farmland is something a bit different, and you might fall foul of the environmental assessment regulations then. But I think we will see further guidance from government on what happens after 30 years, because certainly this is something that makes some landowners and farmers a little bit nervous, because they need to know clarity as to what happens after 30 years. So quickly, because I'm running out of time, in relation to the biodiversity net gain register, so Natural England will be the register operator responsible for establishing and maintaining it. and its purpose is purely to record off-site biodiversity gains and to make the information publicly available. So this is where a developer can't secure biodiversity net gain on site. And what it means is that if development X says, right, I'm going to offset my impacts by creating habitat or using habitat bank Y, that then it's accountable, and we can see that this development has offset his impacts there. I'm a little bit, what government did indicate was that they're not expecting on-site biodiversity enhancement to be part of the BNG register, which I think is a shame, because I would have preferred it had they all been on the same level playing field and we would have had consistency. But I can understand the rationale from government on the basis that any information for on-site enhancement is submitted to the local authority, so that information does exist. And government is looking, perhaps there might be a way of making that information a little bit more obtainable and a little bit more transparent, but it will be in the public domain via the planning portal. It's just you'd have to dig quite hard to find it. And there will be a registration fee, and it's expected to be in the region of between £100 and £1,000 per application, although there is a tenfold increase depending. And finally, it's been a bit of a sort of gallop through, but finally my views, I guess, on the Defra consultation and the way that it's looking and the way that it's heading. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I think. I think the consultation was meaningful, it was well thought out, and government has taken account of some of the concerns that were raised. It's clearly a fast moving and evolving area of policy and work. It's a bit like the Wild West. I think that's partly because policy and guidance is emerging, so people are trying to work out how this is going to work, and people are trying to get ahead of the curve, really, which is quite difficult when we're not quite sure how it's going to work, although the situation is becoming a little bit clearer, and I think it will settle down over time, and I think there will be early winners and I think there will be early losers. It will settle down in time, I think, as the market sorts itself out. It does have, I think, the potential to be a game changer. It's the first time, I think, that developers have had to really account for the environmental impact that they cause. And although there are some inherent problems with the biodiversity metric, I think it's, I mean, version 4 is upon us now, but I think it's fairly well thought through. I mean, there's always going to be issues when we come to try and put a value on the natural environment, but I do think that the net gain approach is one way of looking at it, and it's not too complicated, and it does enable us to look at losses and gains. But I'm also slightly cynical because I realise that there does need to be realistic funding for local planning authorities, and although to its credit government has released additional funding, it's not funding anything like near enough, and enforcement and transparency are going to be very, very important. We've just at Wilding completed a large piece of work for a group of local authorities in the Midlands looking at what they need to do to become biodiversity net gain ready, basically, and this is looking at everything from staffing requirements to supplementary planning policy, looking at audit of their own land, looking at what planning conditions might need to be. And it's fairly clear that they're going to need a fairly substantial resource injection to be able to deliver, because they're going to need ecologists in-house to review the biodiversity game plans and biodiversity information that's submitted with developers, and currently they're nowhere near able to do that. And this is the one thing that worries me slightly, because we do have a fairly regulated planning system in the UK, and on paper the system should work, but we all know that enforcement doesn't always happen because of budget constraints and various things, and developers do get away with things, and planning conditions aren't always enforced. So that's the one thing that worries me slightly. But then again, if it's more money, it's not government funded, if it's coming from third parties and developers, perhaps the money will be generated and enable us to achieve the sort of biodiversity gains that we're looking for. And I also think we will see carbon and climate and biodiversity come closer together, because the two emergencies that the planet are facing at the moment are inextricably linked, and I think we will see much closer alignment of policy as we go forward, because we can't deliver climate and carbon benefit without delivering biodiversity benefit, I think. And that's it. And just a little bit, there's some emerging guidance. So governments produce quite a bit, Natural England's produce quite a bit. We also have to remember that the devolved authorities in the United Kingdom haven't interpreted or enacted the Environment Act in the same way. So they are going their own way, which isn't necessarily helpful, although I kind of understand it, although I would have liked to have seen a more kind of coherent, coordinated approach across the UK. Wales, for example, is focusing on biodiversity net benefit, and Scotland is thinking of slightly different. So it's not going to be applied in the same way across the regional, the dissolved authorities. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Right, wow, there was an awful lot of questions coming in. So what I'm going to say is that we will try and deal with as many as we can in the time that we have. But rest assured that after the session, Mark will get a full list of all the questions and be able to respond to you individually. So everybody will get an answer.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, because it is emerging and there are lots of unanswered questions.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic, and I didn't tell Mark this before we started, but we had 579 people sign up to this.
Blimey.
So, and quite annoyingly, he's broken my record. I'm not bitter at all. Anyway, questions. The first one here was, why can't we use BNG to improve the quality of SSIs?
Well, I think potentially we could, and this is partly what I indicated. You know, maybe government shot itself in the foot, but I think the assumption is, though, is there is already a legal obligation on landowners to make sure that their SSIs are in good condition. Quite a lot of agri-environment funding has gone towards delivering, so things like high level stewardship. So in a sense, we haven't achieved it yet. Yeah, it's a good question, but there's also the potential for SSIs just to suck up all of the available funding, and then that leaves other areas of, you know, local wildlife sites and local nature reserves out in the cold a bit. I think because SSI should be in good condition already, and there are already existing legal drivers and policies to deliver that. But again, we also need to consider that most SSIs aren't in good condition at the moment. So it's a good question, and I don't have a real answer. And I think perhaps it's an opportunity that's been missed.
Okay, I guess there's this sort of a bit of a legislative sort of problem there, as in, like you say, the SSIs should be in favourable condition,
yeah,
therefore they shouldn't require extra help. But everybody knows that most of them aren't in favourable condition, and therefore they do. But okay, I'd sort of linked to that actually. There was another question here about whether we can stack biodiversity units and countryside stewardship higher tier payments. So are you allowed to take those other subsidies and also get the value from the biodiversity units?
Yes, potentially. I mean, government's indicated that might be a possibility, but what it's indicated is that you're not going to get paid to do the same thing twice. So if you can demonstrate that you've delivered over and above what your agri-environment funding is delivering, then if you get an uplift in habitat quality or whatever it may be, then there should be a mechanism to claim for the uplift. But what you won't get is two lots of money to do the same thing. So if you've got stewardship funding to establish a hedgerow, you're not going to get biodiversity net gain money to manage the same hedgerow.
That's the additionality element of it.
That additionality. So it's going to be quite complicated in how this works out, because being able to show a definite uplift and justify an uplift from a baseline condition that's been funded by one pot, and then how you claim for that second pot is going to be something quite complicated, I think. And I think it's likely that we're going to come down to landowners and land managers will decide on one form of funding for one thing and one form of funding for other things. So they might apply for a variety of funding, but the deliverables of those funding mechanisms are likely to be quite precise, I think. But it is complicated, and it's not straightforward.
Sure. And yet to be proven, I guess, and demonstrated.
Yes.
It's all quite early
indeed.
in that process. A question here about renewable energy, which is right in your field here, Mark. Could renewable energy locations, e.g. ground-mounted PV and wind turbines, also be viable for BNG with wildflower planting and potential ponding?
Absolutely. I think particularly with solar, and I think the opportunities with solar are the bits between the panels and the bits underneath the panels, because we're taking land out of agricultural management generally, and there is huge potential for biodiversity gain, and also the riparian margins and field boundaries within solar, because these are areas that generally are retained. They don't chop everything down, and I think there's huge. I think that the thing we need to remember is that solar does have an impact. So ground nesting birds are something that's exercising my brain at the moment, because bird species are unlikely to nest underneath the panels, although they will probably forage underneath the panels. And if we get the management underneath the panels right, then we can probably improve foraging provision. But what we can't do is provide those open spaces for nesting. So where we have sites where we have lapwing and curlew, we have to think about bespoke mitigation for that to make sure that we're maintaining those areas of open ground managed appropriately. But I think solar particularly has huge potential. I think wind less so, just because the footprint of wind is a little bit smaller. It tends to be a fairly defined footprint, but within the kind of the wider scope of wind, I think there is significant opportunity to enhance biodiversity. Absolutely, but it partly comes down to what landowners and land managers and solar developers are prepared to do, because managing under panels can be quite difficult, but there is the potential to cut and graze, providing we get the spacings between panels and the turning circle at the end right, and that sort of thing. But no, I think there's huge potential.
I guess the the question of additionality in there is largely irrelevant, because if the solar bit it's a development, isn't it? You might as well, it's the same as building houses or something. Just because it's renewable energy doesn't mean that you can't then sell the biodiversity credits as a result of how you manage that land underneath the solar.
And if we can I mean, I think with solar, the potential to achieve more than 10% gain is huge, and there's no reason why solar developers shouldn't be able to sell that net benefit. And I mean, people don't like solar. It's the same with any sort of change, and I guess it is quite change in the landscape, but I actually think it is quite a positive, and we need to be selling and we need to be justifying the positive benefits that solar can bring, but it does need to be evidence-based, and we are working with a number of academic institutions to kind of do some of that research to show that we can have a positive effect, and that we've got the kind of baseline studies to show it. So hopefully we'll have a couple of PhDs in the near future looking at things, and then also improving mitigation, so we know how to develop solar farms and get it right. There are still unanswered questions in relation to species, things like foraging bats and things as well. So there's lots to answer with solar, but I think it's all positive.
Yeah, I agree. We're conscious of time, got a few more minutes. One of the themes that came through some of the questions was a little bit around this, what happens after 30 years. So sort of, funny enough, probably linked to the solar bit, because I know that quite a lot of their licenses are 25 to 30 years long as well. So
indeed,
that aligns. How do you see the post 30-year incentives working? So you mentioned in your talk, and I'm sort of trying to paraphrase a number of questions here, but you talked about the fact that there may well be a development over the next the interim years where we trying to incentivize people not just to plow it up and start farming it farming it to an extent that means that they're going to lose all that wildlife benefit. How do you see that working?
Good question, and I don't really know, because I'll have retired by then. It's a long way in the future. I mean, what we're seeing with some of the solar development is landowners are very keen to do environmental enhancement, but they're also quite keen to keep their options open to make sure that they can, if they need to, restore land to agriculture in the long term. But then if we've improved soil health in the short term, then perhaps that's a good thing. I hope we will see more areas of land set aside and managed for nature conservation, but perhaps with an element of agricultural for it. I don't think that agricultural production and wildlife necessarily are mutually exclusive, and I would hope that there will be mechanisms to allow us to retain some of the enhancement that's being delivered. I certainly see on-site biodiversity staying, as long as they're not going to develop on the areas that they've enhanced already. But then again, they need to take account of that with any new development. So I'm hoping we will see a net increase in sort of biodiverse habitats across the country as a whole, but accepting that there will be some losses. But then again, we are the most impoverished nature country in Europe, so anything from a very, very poor starting point has got to be good.
No, absolutely. I do wonder sometimes whether there'd be an element here where we could look at maintenance units. So the biodiversity units that are sold at the moment are about creation and that uplift, but maybe for later on, instead of producing 10 biodiversity units, you could maintain 100 and for roughly the same price, and then that could be put in conservation covenant. A longer run.
Certainly one of the issues that nature conservation is facing, because I come from a wildlife trust background, and certainly they could always get money to buy a reserve, but what they couldn't raise money for was maintenance of reserve. And because of this disconnect between agricultural management and conservation management always costs money for the long-term maintenance, and you'll get to a stage where habitat is about as good as you can get it. So once you've reached SSSI status for a lowland meadow, you can't improve the quality of it anymore, but you still need to manage it in the right way with the hay cut and the aftermath grazing and that sort of thing. But hopefully there might be elements of carbon that could come, because biodiverse habitat sequesters more carbon, although things do reach equilibrium at time. Peat's about the only one that carries on delivering, whereas woodland reaches equilibrium at stage, doesn't it, after a few hundred years. But I would think maintenance units is quite a good idea, actually.
Okay, cool. That last sort of point, then again, I'm paraphrasing and trying to pull some questions together here, but it's to do with the level of enforcement. You mentioned that there wasn't a lot of money set aside or as part of the consultation, and I think the general feeling is that a lot of this it'll either succeed or fail based on that level of enforcement.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's going to work or fail based on whether the enforcement is going to occur, because with the best will in the world, not everybody is going to deliver what they say they will deliver, because there are charlatans and cowboys out there. And I think it's all going to be down to the level of funding and enforcement. That's what's going to make or break this. I mean, we've seen, we have an enforcement regime for water companies, and we've seen the kind of complete degradation and whatever. So we all know that enforcement doesn't work, or it's non-existent, or the enforcement agency is reduced to 2.5 men and a Labrador somewhere that just don't have the capacity to deal with it. So government does need to put its money where its mouth is. But I'm also wondering whether, because of the sale of biodiversity units with the local authority involvement, they'll obviously need to take their cut for the administration. So maybe because it's third-party funding, that will fund the enforcement that's needed. But we'll have to wait and see. I think the problem is everything is so underfunded at the minute. There's always the danger of money being siphoned off to other bits. So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, this is where being an ecologist and a bit of a cynic comes in, is we've kind of seen it all before. I'm not really that hopeful, but there needs to be an element of hope, because otherwise, what are we doing it for?
Excellent. Right, I'm going to step in there before Mark gets too political or too cynical. Try and end on a positive note. I think the general feeling is that this is, on face value, it was a very useful consultation. It was conducted in a serious manner, and they've really taken on board a lot of these things. I think genuinely it's so far so good.
And we need to give government credit for that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. As I said, we have a load of other questions. I'm afraid we haven't had time to get to them, but we will reply to you via email. I'm probably going to leave after this and go and get Mark a new headset. So apologies for the slight issues with the audio, but hopefully most of you picked up most of what he was saying. I'm sure you did. Next month, we have our First Thursday Club on the 3rd of May. We're going to be joined by Andy Greenall from Nature Positive. He's a carbon specialist, and he's going to be talking about Scope 3 greenhouse gas reporting, what, why, and how. So we'll look forward to your company then. Just last thing to say is I hope you all have a lovely Easter break. Eat as much chocolate as you can stomach, and we'll see you all again next month. Thanks, everybody.